Today's episode of Locked On MLB is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. You can follow us on Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. You can follow me at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. And thanks so much for making us your first listen. And be sure to tell your smart device to play podcast Locked On MLB. So today's episode, which is being dropped on the 26th day of January 2023, we're bringing in a special guest, my friend Dan Epstein, who is a wonderful author, the creator of the books Big Hair and Plastic Grass and Stars and Strikes, wrote a wonderful new book about the relationship between two beloved Yankees, an all-time Yankee legend, Thurman Munson, and Ron Blomberg, who was a cult hero amongst Yankee fans in the 1970s. And the book is called The Captain and Me, which Dan Epstein wrote along with Ron Blomberg, about Ron Blomberg's memories of the 1970s Yankees and his special friendship with Thurman Munson, the captain of the Yankees. We sat down. Dan has been a guest on the old podcast, the Sully Baseball Podcast. I can't remember if this is his first time at Locked On MLB. I'm going to apologize for one thing technically. I normally record with one particular program, which I will not name. It didn't work for me, and so we used Zoom. And Zoom doesn't have the best technology for recording video. So there was some issues with the video, maybe slightly out of sync if you're watching it on YouTube. But I still think you'll enjoy, that technical issue aside. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation that we had together. Most of you listen on audio anyway. So I think you're going to like the conversation I had with Dan Epstein about the wonderful book, The Captain and Me, which is available wherever you get your books. And it's about a unique friendship between two players who came up at a time when the Yankees were struggling, and they were two of the players who were hopes for the future, two very different people. And we began our conversation talking a little bit about Thurman Munson, the late Thurman Munson, and why he was such a special figure to this day for Yankee fans. So here's the beginning of my conversation with the great author, Dan Epstein. We're here with the great Dan Epstein with his great book, The Captain and Me. His batting average is super high, as is his slugging and on-base percentage as an author. So whether you like traditional or sabermetric stats, one of my frequent listeners and someone who I have actually met and gone to a ball game with, a fellow named Marcel, who is a huge Cubs fan from Zurich and tours because the Swiss do things right. He gets months off every year and he goes to ballparks all the time. He's nice. Roughly my age, a little bit younger. He doesn't have memories of Thurman Munson. My memories of Thurman Munson, he died when I was 7. I have what I call the rule of 7, which is you start making your concrete memories when you're 7 years old. And to me, Thurman was the Yankees. And I actually remember crying when Munson died as a 7-year-old, even though I was a Boston fan and Fisk and everything. Munson dying just felt wrong. By the way, my initial memories of Ron Blomberg was a Hostess card. Hostess used to have cards on the bottom of the Twinkies and cupcake boxes. And it was a Ron Blomberg with a horribly airbrushed White Sox cap. And on the back is what my brother and I used to call the Year Club, which would say Year Club. And because I was fascinated by how many teams. And it said Ron Blomberg, White Sox, as he's in this watercolor painting. And then I read the back, it doesn't say White Sox. it says just the Yankees.
It's all
But
Yankees.
the year before he didn't. The 77 did not play. 76 one game. So this guy doesn't even play.
2 at-bats. Yeah.
So my initial thoughts of Ron Blomberg is always with the White Sox, kind of like, you're currently wearing a Willie Horton hat. My initial memory of Willie Horton was one of the great figures in Detroit Tigers history. But my first memory of him is always with the Toronto Blue Jays, because I saw him with a Blue Jays uniform in my Topps card. Oh, well, Willie Horton, Blue Jay, great. My first memory of Tom Seaver is Tom Seaver, Cincinnati Red, great. Tony Perez of the Expos.
The Expos, yeah.
But that's true. That's how I, but I do remember, obviously the death of Munson was just had ripple effects. But the reason I brought up my friend Marcel is because he asked me. He said, because I brought up this book, and I had brought up Thurman in a previous episode, and he says, I don't remember Thurman. Why was he so significant in Yankee history? And he's not saying that out of ignorance. It's just it happened before his fandom. And Munson, the death of Munson had ripple effects for decades. And Diana Munson, who wrote the foreword to the book, still gets a huge standing ovation every time she shows up to Old Timers Day. And even as a Red Sox fan, it's kind of like you could trash any Yankee, but Munson you hold, if there's a certain age group of a Yankee fan, you don't talk trash about Munson. You have to sort of take your hands up.
Right.
From your opinion, why was Munson such a significant figure in Yankee history? Obviously, his death was shocking, but he meant so much to the team before the plane crash. Just describe for listeners what he meant to the revival of the Yankees and to the Yankee franchise just in general.
Well, I mean, first things, he comes up in 1970 after having just played a few games, well, I guess he played most of the month of September in 1969. I mean, they kind of knew. I mean, Ralph Houck, who was the Yankee manager, was already talking in the fall of '69 that Thurman was going to be their starting catcher in 1970. And this is a guy who was like, 2 years out of college. It was just like, no, this is the guy. And he comes up in 1970. He wins the Rookie of the Year award. I mean, he is fantastic. He's a fantastic hitter. He's very talented fielder and has kind of an unorthodox way of throwing, but has an incredibly quick release that makes it very difficult to steal bases successfully on him. But he's also incredibly talented at working with pitchers. So even though he's a rookie, really quickly the entire Yankee staff kind of fell into line. It was like, okay, what this guy says, I will do. And and for the rest of the 70s, it was kind of like whenever the Yankees would have a pitcher who would get into it with Thurman and not take his advice, the guy usually wound up losing or serving up a home run in a key situation, and usually didn't wind up staying with the team for very long, because it was like, no, Thurman knows what's up. Thurman knows how to call a game. Thurman just, Ron in the book talks about Thurman was basically a computer in clubs. This was, well before, advanced statistical analysis made its way into the clubhouse. And Thurman certainly was not looking over the stat sheets beforehand.
Or the video, video was still relatively in its infancy at that time. The instant replay was in the infancy at its time.
Absolutely. So Thurman had an incredible knack for just absorbing information. A guy comes up, and hits against the team in spring training once. Thurman already has a mental file on him. And so they, 2 months later, the guy gets into a game against the Yankees. Thurman knows how to pitch to him. Just like he's he remembers the guy, he remembers the pitch that got him out. Back in spring training, convinces the pitcher this is what we got to throw, and boom, you get him out. He had a similar knack for base runners, just like knowing how they took their leads when they would take off. That there was when Ron LaFleur comes up to the big leagues, Thurman can't wait to face LaFleur because they've heard like, this guy is, he's an ex-con who's with the Tigers. He can, run like the wind. And Thurman's like, okay, yeah, let's see how fast this guy is. And LaFleur winds up, stealing a couple of bases on him the first time they face him. But it's so close that LaFleur never really tries again because it's just like, okay, I got away with it, but this guy has me made now. So, I mean, that was, and Thurman was officially named the Yankees' first captain since Gehrig in 1976. But as Ron talks about it in the book, Thurman was a little embarrassed by that because he felt like he was being, like that was his role anyway, and he didn't feel like he needed to make a big deal out of it. And
we'll get back to Dan Epstein in a moment, but right now I want to tell you that the NFL playoffs are here, and we're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the #1 sports book in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make sports betting fun and easy. New customers can join today and get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads to player props. Plus, you could even combine your bets for a chance to get a bigger payout with same game parlay. All that on an app that's safe, secure, and easy to use. So, football fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get a $150 prize in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports book partner of the NFL. How did you get involved with Ron Blomberg on this book project? I mean, I know that's a basic question, but I'm curious. How did this meeting of two dudes, how did this happen?
So what happened was my friend David Jordan, who wrote this great book with Dave Parker called Cobra.
Who's been a guest on this? He's been a guest on this podcast. Dave Jordan.
Excellent. Yes. So
yeah.
Dave.
Yeah.
Great dude. Friend of mine for a while. He basically, his agent, his and Parker's agent for that book is also Ron's agent. And so his agent had been talking to Dave about maybe, he was like, Ron Blomberg has some ideas for a book. Would you be interested in collaborating with him? And at the time, Dave was completely mired in trying to get the Cobra thing happening. And there was too much on his plate. And he was like, I can't do this, but you should talk to Dan Epstein because, he's Mr. 70s baseball. He's Jewish, like what more do you want? So Dave calls me, and at the time, I think I had just moved to North Carolina, and I had just gone through about a year and a half stretch where I kept doing book proposals with other people, not in baseball, in the music world. And the proposals would go nowhere. And I just thought, like, this is a lot of work. I'm not making any money. This is really depressing. And so when Dave calls me about Ron doing something with Ron, I was just like, I don't know, man. I've been down this road. Ron's already had a book out called Designated Hero, which he wrote with another author. And I just thought, I'm really not up for this. And Dave, to his credit, just said, look, why don't you just give him a call? At the very least, you can save a phone conversation with Ron Blomberg. I was like, okay, fair enough. Yes, I've always, enjoyed the legend of Ron Blomberg. And, I'll ask him if he really likes knishes, like it said on the back of his, 1972 card or whatever. And so anyway, we got on the phone and we totally hit it off, just like right out of the gate. I mean, part of it is just one of the most effusive, friendly people you'll ever meet. And he was funny, and he had all these stories, and he had another. Actually, like the Thurman book was not his first idea. He wanted to do a book about the designated hitter,
Mhm.
and
And
but
for
it
those
was
of
a
it,
little unclear.
and for the listeners, Ron was the first ever designated hitter. That's why he's so associated with it. The first, when they introduced the DH rule in 1973, so we're now the 50th anniversary of a half century of the designated hitter. The first time there ever was a DH who came to the plate, it was Ron Blomberg. It was against Boston, right? It was against
Yes,
okay,
yeah,
because and it was and Cepeda, was he the Red Sox DH?
yeah,
Okay,
and,
I should have your book open to double check this, but so the first so
yeah.
so it was his other book was designated Hebrew. His bat is in the Hall of Fame because it's the first ever DH in the history of baseball. So that's why Ron Blomberg is so historically attached to the designated hitter. Just for some of
Right.
our fans out there who may not know the connection as well as Dan and I do.
Yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough. So he wanted to write a book about the designated hitter, but he was a little unclear, or I was a little unclear about like what he wanted this book to be. And also, I'm not a fan of the designated hitter. I never have been. So it just seemed like and all, but again, like with the Hall of Fame, like at some point I just can't have these arguments anymore. So I just vision like doing a book on the designated hitter and having to sit through or participate in, even worse, arguments about the designated hitter in every interview I did to promote the book. So I was just like, yeah, I don't think I want to do this, man. So, but was started talking about Thurman and that they had been good friends and they'd been roommates, which I didn't know because, I became a baseball fan in 1976. And at the time, so I absorbed everything I could about what was going on in baseball at the time. But at the time, Ron Blomberg was on the DL and he was on DL all season. So, like, I remember getting his 1976 Topps card in a pack and going, who the hell is this guy? Like, he's clearly, like, he's not on the Yankees that I'm aware of, but, it says that, he's a 300 hitter. Like, what's up with this? But I didn't even, think of it. So Ron is kind of like, with the exception of that one season, 78, where he comes back with the White Sox, Ron is like sort of, player from the before times for me. So I don't
Right.
know that other than the DH thing, don't really know that much about him or have that much invested in, the legend of Ron Blomberg. So, so that he was so tight with a guy that I grew up absolutely worshiping, which was Thurman Munson, was news to me. But it was also like, oh, I want to hear these stories. And then the more we talked, it was like, you know what? I think other people are going to want to hear these stories too, because this is a side of Thurman, both as a player, as a teammate, as a human being that that a lot of people don't know about. And I thought, combine that with the kind of the respective arc of their careers, you have the makings of a really interesting book. Plus, Ron is a really good storyteller. He was never one for boozing or drugs, so his faculties are still, for a ball player talking about things that happened 50 years ago, he's still pretty sharp. I mean, sometimes he'll forget, he'll get the year wrong that something happened, and so that was a lot
So
of
did
my
we.
role book.
So did we.
Right? Yeah, no, right. Exactly. So can't fault. So that was a lot of my role in the book, was like he'd tell me the story and it would be like, okay, and then I would like go back through the newspapers to kind of check it out. It's like, that's a good story, but that doesn't sound like something that happened in 1973 because, this player and that player weren't actually on the team yet. So it's like, is he getting the year wrong or is he getting the players wrong? So it was a lot of like, then circling back to him and going, Ron, Nettles wasn't on the team then. So are you thinking of blah, 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 or, or Nettles was on the team, but maybe you're thinking of a couple of years later. And so there's a lot of back
Right.
and forth trying to drill down and get it as close to correct as possible.
Thanks so much for making Locked On MLB your first listen every day. Locked On MLB Prospects, that should be your second listen. Host Lindsey Crosby is a prospect encyclopedia, and he's going deep on the MLB stars of tomorrow. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And now back to my interview with author Dan Epstein, where we're going to be talking about his book, The Captain and Me. I'll tell you, we're with Dan Epstein about the great book, Captain and Me, which I just finished reading. This is the third book of yours that I've read, Big Hair and Plastic Grass, which I love, Stars and Stripes, which I actually like a little better, because it seems like that's the Shelby Foote sort of a recount of the 1976 season. I love this book. One of the things that I really like about this book is, first of all, it's not like it's not a laborious biography of Ron Blomberg where we have to hear every single detail of his childhood. But also, don't read this book on an empty stomach, because there's a lot of talk of eating and food right from the beginning. I love things like this where you're talking about the historic day of the first ever DH. And because he doesn't have to go out on the field, he could stay in the clubhouse. And you talk about deviled eggs in the fact that the Vinny Orlando, who was the clubhouse assistant or clubhouse manager or whatever at Fenway Park. I love they describe the food as terrible usually at Fenway Park, that they usually have awful kielbasa and sauerkraut. But this day he made this gigantic plate of deviled eggs, of which Ron Blomberg kept going in and taking them. And apparently Munson and I think Mel Stottlemyre and someone else kept saying, don't eat all the damn deviled eggs. Don't eat all the damn deviled eggs. And I think that's the first chapter in here. So I'm reading this book and I'm getting hungry for deviled eggs right from the beginning here. You want to go to it, but you also want to go to a deli. Sorry, keep going. Absolutely.
No, I mean, Ron loves food. He loves food almost as much as he loves baseball. And he can talk about food as much. And and it was so often our conversations would just devolve into food related stuff. Like, I haven't eaten meat in about 5 years. I've been, vegetarian, pescatarian, whatever you call it. And Ron is completely fried by this and just absolutely baffled. It's just like, so you don't eat turkey? I was like, no, Ron, I don't eat turkey. Well, what about chicken? No, Ron, I don't eat any meat. But I was telling him about, and this is not necessarily a plug, although if you can get some advertising out of these people, great. I am a big fan of non-meat sausages, especially the Italian ones. Right. And so I was telling him about it, and I was like, it was like, Ron, honestly, like you slap these on the grill, like you can't tell that these are not real Italian sausages. And Ron's like, he's like, do you put peppers on them? I was like, oh yeah, peppers, onions, little tomato sauce, and throw on a bun. Ron just goes, he's just sort of like drifting off into this, Homer Simpson like trance, thinking about it. So, I love reading.
I love reading about because he was a Jewish man in Atlanta. And one of the reasons he wanted to go to the Yankees is he felt he wanted to be amongst his people in so many ways. And you had so many amazing descriptions of the delis that he would go to and bring Thurman Munson to introduce this boy from Canton, Ohio, what a brisket is, what, corned beef sandwich, all this stuff. And
what kreplach is,
and kreplach and matzo ball soup and all these things you're describing, and I had to have like water near me because I was feeling the sodium increase. when I was reading. I think my blood pressure went up a little bit. Certainly, my cholesterol level went up while I was reading this book. I had to be drinking. I had to have a 2 liter bottle of water next to you while you drink, because I'm just remembering going to like Katz's Deli when I was living in New York, and I could just taste the pastrami while you I think you should have like there should be like some of the, like when you read Big Hair and Plastic Grass or Stars and Strikes, and there's the music that you should be listening to when you're reading the book. Here you should have the sandwiches you should be reading. You have devil legs for chapter 1, you have a brisket for number 2, get some some kreplach soup for chapter 3. Then my mouth was watering when I was reading this book here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. Like, I've never since going vegetarian, I have never craved corned beef and pastrami much as I have while working on this book. Because man, I always enjoyed that when I was a carnivore, and man, he sure sold it.
Hey, I don't want to. There's a couple people I want to talk about. There's Nate, God, you said his name again. Nat, what was his last name again?
Tarnopol.
Tarnopol, thank you. I have to write this stuff down. Tarnopol. One of the really fascinating borderline Scorsese film moments when I was reading the book was this unusual relationship they had with someone who was essentially a gangster. Essentially a 70s gangster. Just hear Ray Liotta's narration, and may rest in peace, in your head. This really seemed like, wow, there's a couple of chapters here that I just was, because of course the best moments of Goodfellas were in the 70s, and I'm imagining Munson and Blomberg wandering in and out, kind of like the Copacabana scene in Goodfellas. They got involved with a fellow who's in the music industry, and they got to meet a lot of great singers and R&B performers and everything, but also guys showing up with a briefcase and then we got to go now, or people showing up with guns on their, and of course Blomberg at first was kind of like, I don't know what it was. I thought he just was giving us a car. It seemed like a nice thing, and Munson seemed to be a little more. I guess his antenna was up a little quicker than Ron Blomberg was. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the fact that these two, the two protagonists of your book, were basically hanging around with a Henry Hill character.
Yeah, Nat was the president of a record label called Brunswick Records. A lot of people don't remember now, but in the 60s and first half of the 70s, Brunswick was a major player in R&B and soul music. The people like Jackie Wilson, Young Holt Unlimited, Shy-Lights. I mean, a lot of like heavy duty hits came out of Brunswick. And Nat was a Jewish guy from Detroit. Actually, that's where he first hooked up with Jackie Wilson as his manager. And Nat was obsessed with baseball all his life, grew up a Hank Greenberg fan, and supposedly talented enough to be scouted by the Tigers, although it didn't happen. But by the time Ron meets him, Nat is a season ticket holder at the Yankees games, sitting in a box seat right next to the field. He's pals with lots of players who he basically, does things for, like, invites them to dinner, buys them suits, things. And so
I'm sorry.
When
does things for.
Yeah. So when the Yankees finally have a Jewish star in the making in Ron, Nat is incredibly excited because he's Jewish and he's baseball obsessive, and here's Ron, and he also kind of takes Ron under his wing, like, we're gonna make sure you're treated right, and, so like he'll do these things like set Ron up in this sweet apartment building in the Bronx, all furnished with shag carpeting and the latest, stereo TVs and all this. And Ron's just always like, I can't pay for this, Nat. And Nat's like, don't worry, it's, we'll take care of you. And then when, and then Thurman kind of is brought into this circle as well, and Nat buys Mercedes Benzes for both Ron and Thurman, and because they're kind of Nat's favorite players on the team, and a lot of the other players are kind of like jockeying for position, trying to like get Nat to do something nice for them like that. But it's like obviously these guys are considered on a higher level by Nat. And so they go to dinner all the time with Nat. They go out during the off season. Nat hires Ron to kind of basically hang around the Brunswick offices. This is in a period when pre-free agency, when players still have to work in the off season, most of them. Mm-hmm. And so Ron just gets this like nothing job where he's, paid a ridiculous amount of money just to hang around, be like, the pet Yankee. And so, yes, and Nat being part of the music business, and the music business at that time was especially corrupt and connected. And so there were all kinds of mobsters that Nat was running with. And, so there would be all these evenings where, or even just afternoons at the Brunswick offices where they're hanging out with Nat and a couple of his guys, who are essentially hitmen. And then like some other gangsters show up, but there's this, like Ron makes it really clear, and we get into this book where it's like Ron and Thurman were never asked to do anything. They were never asked to throw games. They were never asked to, do favors. It was all just like these guys were such Yankee fans that they were just stoked to have Thurman and Ron hanging out with them, and that they could like ask any question about any baseball thing, and these guys would answer and tell stories. Like that's literally all these guys wanted out of the relationship. It wasn't, and the Yankee, the Yankee front office was very nervous about this. Mm-hmm. Because they knew who Nat was. In fact, Nat had tried to buy the team at one point.
What an alternate universe that is. What an alternate universe.
I know.
He buys him instead of George Steinbrenner.
That was never going to happen.
Oh, I know. But like this thing, I've always thought of the alternate universe where Steinbrenner initially wanted to buy the Cleveland Indians, of what that world would have been like if he had bought the Cleveland Indians. And folks, they were called the Indians back then. If he bought the Indians instead of the Yankees, the history
Nat Darnell goes and buys the Yankees.
How those two histories would have diverged. But that they it struck me, and I will put a button here on the Nat here, but it struck me that both Ron and Thurman were kind of like living baseball cards to them. Like this was one of the perks of being a gangster, is you get to hang around with musicians, you get to hang out with movie stars and TV stars and ball players. And and so it wasn't that Thurman and Ron were connected or corrupt players. They were perks. They were perks for mobsters. This is why you do it, is you get to hang around with famous people. Absolutely. The only time it gets hairy is there's a storybook where, and this wasn't a Nat thing. This was they also hung out with Jay Black of the group Jay and the Americans, who was also connected, and so Ron gets kind of sucked into this errand that Jay had to run in Little Italy, or basically going down to an Italian restaurant. And Ron just thinks like, hey, we're going to an Italian restaurant. He's like, thinking about all the food he's going to order. And basically they just go in, Jay picks up a briefcase full of cash, and they split. And, and it's only kind of like in retrospect that Ron realizes like, oh, that could have been really ugly. It's if the transaction hadn't gone as it was supposed to, things could have gotten real out of hand. And, until he tells Thurman about this later, and Thurman's like,
yeah, glad I missed out on that dinner.
Thanks so much for listening to this conversation with my friend Dan Epstein and his wonderful book, The Captain and Me, available wherever you get your books, online, in person. Go check out some of his previous books, including Big Hair and Plastic Grass, Stars and Stripes. If you're a rock and roll fan, there's no shortage of articles and things he's written. Go check him out. And thanks so much again for making us your first listen every day. Follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and on Instagram. Tomorrow, I have a bit of my conversation with Miller Thomas. We'll be talking more about the Hall of Fame and the fact that the Red Sox are rudderless and a couple of other things. And there'll be more of this conversation I had with Dan Epstein, which will be played some point next week. Not quite sure when. But thank you, Dan Epstein, for joining me. And for everyone else, thanks so much for listening. This has been Locked On MLB. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.